In the winter of 1982, a magazine landed on newsstands across America with a small article buried near the back. It was not a cover story. It was not a major expose. It was a profile of a singer, a man who had been famous for 25 years, who had sold more records than almost anyone alive, whose voice had played in more American living rooms than perhaps any voice in the history of recorded music. The article ran, and within 48 hours, the phone calls began. Radio stations, promoters, the record label, all of them calling, all of them saying the same thing in different words. What did you do? What were you thinking? Do you understand what you've just cost yourself? Johnny Mathis understood exactly what he had cost himself. He had been calculating it for 30 years. Every December, when his Christmas albums flooded the airwaves and his voice filled department stores and church halls and the kitchens of mothers across this country, he had been calculating it. Every time a journalist asked him about romance and he smiled and said nothing and changed the subject smoothly, gracefully, the way a man does when he has practiced the deflection so many thousands of times that it no longer even feels like a lie. He was calculating it. 30 years of silence, 30 years of Christmas albums and hit records and standing ovations and the most successful greatest hits package in the history of Billboard, a record that stood for nearly 2 decades. And underneath all of it, every single day, the secret. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you that story. Not the story on the album sleeve, not the one that Columbia Records approved, the real one. The one about what it costs a man to give the world his voice completely, entirely, without a single note held back, and keep one room of himself locked for 30 years. So get comfortable. Pour yourself something. We are going back to San Francisco, to a steep street in the Fillmore district, in the autumn of 1935, to a small house where a woman named Mildred is about to bring a 4th child into a family that does not have much money, but has quietly and without ceremony more music than most families will ever know. His name will be John Royce Mathis, and he will carry a secret longer than most people carry anything. The Fillmore district of San Francisco in 1935 was a world unto itself. It had been built by the city's black community over decades, a neighborhood of jazz clubs and gospel churches and barbershops and corner stores, and the particular energy that comes when a community is denied access to most of what a city offers, and so builds its own version of everything. It was loud and close and musical in the way that only places built on shared struggle tend to be musical. The sound was in the walls. It was in the evenings. It came up through the floorboards. Clem Mathis, Johnny's father, had grown up inside that sound. He had taught himself piano by ear, the way many men of his generation learned the things they loved. Not from a teacher, not from a school, but from sitting alone with an instrument long enough that the instrument eventually surrendered its secrets. He was not a professional musician. He worked whatever work he could find. But when the day ended and the house quieted, he played. When his son was born in September 1935, Clem looked at that boy and made a decision. Not out loud, not ceremonially. The way fathers sometimes decide things, quietly, privately, with a certainty they cannot quite explain. He decided the music would not stay inside the house. By the time Johnny was 3, he was singing around the kitchen. By the time he was 6, Clem had found him a voice teacher, not a piano teacher, not a music tutor, a voice teacher. A classically trained instructor named Connie Cox, who taught breath control and phrasing and the difference between a note that is merely sung and a note that is supported, shaped, made to hold. It was expensive. There were 6 children. The money was always tight. The lessons continued anyway. Connie Cox understood immediately what he was working with. He told Clem Mathis what Clem Mathis had already suspected. This voice did not belong only to the Fillmore. This voice, if it was trained properly, if it was developed with patience and discipline and taken seriously as the instrument it was, could go anywhere. could do anything. Johnny Mathis took the lessons seriously. He also, in those same years, became a gifted athlete, a high jumper. By the time he reached San Francisco State University, he was ranked among the top high jumpers in the country for his age group. He held records. Coaches took notice. There were conversations, real ones, not flattering ones, about the Olympic trials. He was good enough at both that the choice was genuinely unclear for a time. In 1955, a man named George Avakian came to San Francisco on business. Avakian worked for Columbia Records in New York. He had signed Miles Davis. He had an ear for what mattered, not what was merely good, but what was necessary. The kind of voice that fills a room not because it is loud, but because it is inevitable. He heard Johnny Mathis sing in a small club and sat very still for a long time afterward. He wrote a letter to New York that same week. The letter was brief. It said, in essence, I have found something you need to hear immediately. Columbia Records sent the contract shortly after. And in 1956, John Royce Mathis faced the clearest choice his life had yet offered him. The Olympic trials were approaching. He had qualified. There was a version of his life in which he went to Melbourne, jumped higher than almost anyone in the world, and came home a different kind of famous. He chose the music. He would never publicly say he regretted it. But there are moments in the interviews, the long ones, the careful ones, the ones where the journalist has finally earned enough trust that the answers stop being rehearsed, where you can see him sit with the question, the road not taken, the jump not made. The other version of himself that existed briefly and then didn't. He let it go, and he went to New York. His first album, simply called Johnny Mathis, was released in 1956. It was a careful debut. Columbia was patient. They understood what they had, and they were willing to give the country time to understand it too. They did not have to wait very long. Wonderful. Wonderful was released in 1957. It is almost impossible from this distance to fully communicate what happened next. The song did not simply chart, it settled. It found its way into the evenings of a country that was changing very fast and was, in many ways, deeply tired of changing. The Second World War was 12 years in the past. Korea was 4 years in the past. Television had arrived in the living room. Rock and roll was rearranging the furniture of American music. Everything was moving. Johnny Mathis sounded like the room before it started moving. His voice was not the voice of challenge. It was not the voice of rebellion or the wild, urgent energy that Elvis was bringing from Memphis or that Little Richard was bringing from everywhere at once. It was something else entirely, something older and more specific. The voice of a slow dance at the end of a long evening. The voice of a feeling that people were not entirely sure they were allowed to have anymore. The feeling of stillness, of safety, of a world that held. America heard that voice and stopped. Chances are followed. Wonderful, wonderful. Then it's not for me to say. Then Misty, which would become perhaps his most famous recording, a song so associated with him that decades later, people would still struggle to hear it in any other voice. The Greatest Hits album arrived in 1958. It would spend 490 weeks on the Billboard chart. 490 weeks, nearly 10 years. A record that would stand until Michael Jackson's Thriller finally surpassed it in the 1980s. To this day, some music historians believe the official count may actually understate it. He was on television constantly. The Perry Como Show, The Ed Sullivan Show, the specials that networks produced for the holidays, where families gathered around the set and the performers came out in formal clothes and sang the songs everyone knew. Johnny Mathis was on all of them, and the Christmas music began. Merry Christmas, his first holiday album, was released in 1958. It was followed by another, and another, and another. By the late 1960s, there was a version of December in America that was simply unthinkable without the sound of Johnny Mathis. department stores, radio stations, the background of every Christmas party in every home across the country. He had become, without anyone quite deciding this should happen, the sound of the holiday itself, the sound of family, of tradition, of everything wholesome and warm and known. And he was performing it all. Every television appearance, every Christmas special, every interview, while maintaining, with absolute precision, an image of himself that was true in every detail, except the one that was most true. No one in his public life asked directly. The culture of 1958, of 1962, of 1967 did not ask directly. There were rules about what questions were appropriate for a music journalist to put to a famous singer, and certain questions were simply not among them. When a journalist did edge toward the personal, toward romance, toward a companion, toward the ordinary domestic life that celebrity profiles were expected to include, Johnny Mathis was ready. He was always ready. He had been preparing the answer since before he arrived in New York. He smiled. He said something gracious. He spoke about the music. The subject moved on. This is the part of the story that is hardest to hold properly, because it requires holding two things at the same time that seem like they should cancel each other out. On one hand, the extraordinary joy of the music, the genuine love he had for singing, for performing, for the moment when a note lands exactly where it should and the audience feels it physically and the room changes. That was real. None of it was performance in the way people sometimes imagine. A mask worn resentfully over a miserable inner life. He loved his work. He was extraordinary at it. And underneath the joy, every single day, the weight of the thing he was not saying, not guilt, not shame in the way that word is usually meant, but the weight of a man who knows that the room he is standing in has been built on a foundation that would crack if one particular truth were spoken aloud. He carried it the way a very strong person carries something heavy, without complaining, without showing the effort, eventually almost without noticing. Almost. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this specific situation. Not the loneliness of isolation. Johnny Mathis was not isolated. He had friends, he had collaborators, he had a life full of people who genuinely cared for him. He lived well in Los Angeles, in a home that reflected the success he had worked for since he was 6 years old, standing in a cold room doing breathing exercises. But the loneliness of a man who cannot be fully seen is its own particular thing. Every relationship conducted in half-light. Every party attended with a version of yourself that is accurate in every respect except the most fundamental one. Every interview where you answer the question you were asked while not answering the question underneath it, the one about who you actually are, not who you perform. He understood with absolute clarity what would happen if he spoke. This was not a theoretical fear. He had watched what happened. In the 1950s and 1960s, being gay in public life did not simply mean social disapproval, though the social disapproval was total and crushing. It meant legal exposure in many states. It meant the end of a career with no possibility of return. It meant being handed a certain specific kind of newspaper story, the kind that followed a man for the rest of his life, that became the first sentence of every paragraph written about him afterward. He had built something extraordinary. 300 million records sold, a sound so deeply woven into the fabric of American culture that most Americans could not imagine December without it. He was not going to hand that story to a journalist. So, the calculation continued. Year after year, album after album, the Christmas specials, the award shows, the profile pieces in which he spoke eloquently about music, about San Francisco, about his father's piano playing, about Connie Cox and what those early lessons had meant. All of it true. All of it carefully bounded. He was very good at it. He had been practicing since before most of the journalists interviewing him were born. The weight of it, he would say later, much later, in the interviews that came after 1982 was not primarily the fear. though the fear was real. The weight was the accumulation, the sheer quantity of years during which the thing was held. The way a secret, after long enough, stops being a thing you are keeping and becomes instead the shape of your life. He had built his life around the space where the secret was. And in 1982, something shifted. He could not name it precisely in later interviews. He tried more than once, and the answers were never quite the same. Sometimes he spoke about tiredness, not the tiredness of a man who is ill, but the tiredness of a man who has been holding a particular posture for 30 years and one day simply decides he is done holding it. Sometimes there was a longer silence, and in the silence you could hear everything the words were not saying. What is certain is this. In the summer of 1982, a journalist named Lawrence Grobel was preparing a profile for U.S. Magazine. It was intended to be a standard piece. Career retrospective, legacy. The statistics, which were genuinely astonishing. During that interview, something happened that had not happened before. Johnny Mathis told the truth. He did not announce it. He was not dramatic. There was no prepared statement, no press conference, no carefully choreographed moment designed to manage the news cycle. He simply, in the course of a conversation, said what was true. He confirmed that he was gay. The article ran. And then the telephone started ringing. Radio stations across the country, not all of them, but enough, pulled his music from rotation. Program directors, who had been playing Johnny Mathis for 25 years, suddenly found other programming. The Christmas albums, which had been automatic fixtures since 1958, were quietly removed from some schedules. His label was not pleased. The calls from Columbia Records were, by all accounts, not comfortable conversations. A portion of his audience disappeared, not the majority. Not even close to the majority. The devotion that his listeners felt for him was the kind built over 25 years, the kind that does not vanish overnight simply because a fact has changed, but a portion. And in a career built on the mathematics of mass appeal, a portion matters. A portion is heard very clearly. He had known this would happen. He had run exactly this calculation in his head for 30 years. He had known what the response would look like, and he had said it anyway. When asked later what made him speak, he did not give a complicated answer. He said that he had simply grown tired, that a man reaches a point where the weight of a kept secret becomes heavier than whatever he feared the truth might cost him. He said, "I knew what would happen. I said it anyway." That sentence is either very simple or very complicated, depending on who you are and what you have carried. The year 1982 was a particular moment in America to make this particular disclosure. The country was in the early days of what would become the AIDS crisis, a catastrophe that was being greeted in many quarters with a specific combination of fear and contempt and the impulse to locate the danger somewhere outside ordinary American life. The word gay carried associations in 1982 that it had not carried before and would not carry forever, but carried then with tremendous, terrible weight. To say what he said, in that specific year, to that specific country, knowing with certainty what the response would be, required something. What to call that something is a question worth sitting with. He was 46 years old. He had given America his voice since he was 20. He had given it without reservation, without condition, without anything held back. 300 million records, 40 years of Christmas. The sound of a country's most private feelings returned to them, shaped into songs they could hold on to. He had asked nothing in return. In 1982, he asked for one thing. He asked to be known. The years after 1982 were not a disaster. That needs to be said plainly, because the story is sometimes framed as a tragedy, and it is not entirely that. Johnny Mathis did not disappear. His career did not end. The audience that had loved him for 25 years did not, as a whole, walk away. Many of them, the vast majority of them, simply continued. They bought the records, they came to the concerts, They called the radio stations and asked why certain stations had stopped playing the music, and some of those stations quietly reversed course. But things were different, undeniably different. The effortless, universal acceptance that had been the foundation of his career. That particular quality of being everyone's artist, the voice with no edges that could belong equally to the grandmother in Ohio and the teenager in California and the couple slow dancing in a living room somewhere in the middle of the country, that was not quite the same again. It could not be. The mask had come off, and without the mask, the image was no longer able to be all things to all people. He navigated it the way he had navigated everything, with discipline, with the habit of work that Clem Mathis had built into him before he was old enough to understand what it was for, with the voice that had never let him down. He continued recording. He continued touring. He found, over the years following 1982, that the audience that remained was in some ways more genuinely his than the audience before. Not the audience for an image, the audience for a man. There is a kind of loyalty that only becomes possible when you are fully known. He was learning, for the first time, what that felt like. The honors came eventually, as they always do, when a career is long enough and the work is good enough. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, the multiple certifications for record sales, the acknowledgement from the industry that had been quietly uncomfortable with him for a decade, that what he had done over 50 years of recording could not be dismissed or minimized or filed quietly away. He was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. His name appeared on the kind of lists that are compiled when a generation of music journalists reaches the age of looking backward and deciding what actually mattered. What mattered, they decided, was the voice. The voice had always been the thing. It was the thing George Avakian had heard in that San Francisco club in 1955, and known immediately. It was the thing that had survived everything. The secret and the revelation and the years of calculation and the years of consequence. The voice did not change, because the man had told the truth about himself. If anything, in the recordings made after 1982, there are those who hear something different in it. Harder to name. Closer to the surface. Something that sounds, if you are listening for it, like relief. He is in his late 80s now. He still performs when he is well enough. There is footage from recent years of Johnny Mathis on stage, standing in the same careful posture he always had, looking out at audiences who have been coming to see him for 60 years, and singing. The voice has changed, as all voices change. But the quality at the center of it, the thing Connie Cox recognized in a child in the Fillmore, the thing that Clem Mathis paid for with extra hours of work so that a boy with a gift would not waste it, that quality is still there. The warmth of it. The particular way a note lands and holds until you feel it in your chest, rather than simply hear it with your ears. That is not something you can perform. You can perform a great many things over 60 years, as Johnny Mathis knew better than almost anyone. But that quality, the one that makes a voice feel like it is telling the truth, that either comes from somewhere real, or it doesn't come at all. His came from somewhere real. It always had. The thing he hid was not the voice. The voice was always fully given. The thing he hid was the man behind it. And when, finally, at 46 years old, after 30 years of Christmas albums and careful smiles and the practiced deflection of questions he had been avoiding since before most of the people asking them were born, when he finally gave that away too, the voice did not change. It simply had nowhere left to hide. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you hear that voice, in December, in someone's kitchen, on an evening that feels like it's ending too soon, remember what it took to make it, remember what he carried, and how long he carried it alone.